On today's show, more questions than answers after the game in Hershey.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Dan Holme. I've covered the Capitals for the past 30 seasons for Locked On and various other outlets before that. I'm also the host of the weekly show called The Capitals Minute Cast, available wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, more questions than answers after the Capitals-Flyers game in Hershey, and in a good way. The players that played better than I think a lot of us had expected, making it that much more difficult on Spencer Carberry and Chris Patrick. Andrew Cristall was one of those guys that made it that much more difficult. I'll talk about him. A bit later, we'll talk about the John Carlson question. Yes, we know that he is entering into a contract year, and the Capitals and, well, John Carlson are pretty non-committal about their future. But just to get it going here, the roster battle questions after the game in Hershey. And it's interesting as this all goes on. You think to yourself, well, there's some answers. There's players that are elevating, maybe some players that are taking some steps back. And to be clear here, there are players that have elevated themselves. I'm going to talk about, in particular, Sonny Milano. I'm going to talk about Hendrix, Lapierre, Vincent Iorio, to name a few that really took steps forward, and then players that I think need to make a bit more noise if they want to continue to be in the conversation. I'm talking about Ethan Frank, for example, a guy that's got a little bit lost in the shuffle. Has a good skill set here, but he needs to be engaged if he wants to stand out and even stand a chance of making the roster. So let's talk about those battles after Hershey here in the first segment of today's show. And Sonny Milano, I mean, banging the drum, making a case. Look at me. 2 goals. He looked dangerous. Like nearly every shift he was out there, and you could just see it in the way he carried himself confidently, the vision, the finish, and just the way that he attacked the net, that he is making a case for himself to make a spot on this roster. And that's ultimately the Sonny Milano that can be a difference maker in, I'm going to go ahead and say the bottom 6, maybe even play up in the lineup if needed. And, when we take a look at Sonny Milano, before what I saw he had in the tank in these preseason games and at camp, I thought to myself, well, here's a guy that is just going to be eliminated from the mix. You take a look at the young talent within the organization. You take a look at Leonard, Cristall, Miroshnichenko. Is there really a place for Sonny Milano in the Capitals lineup? I think that he is making a big case for himself that, yes, he in fact does need to be a part of this season's Capitals team. Definitely a player to circle and watch as this all goes along. He is definitely gaining steam the more and more games that he's in the mix. And let's be honest, when we talk about Milano, that this is a huge camp for him. He had, an up and down season last season, primarily out of the mix just due to injuries and inconsistency. But he's showing right now that he wants a spot and he's fighting for it. And that's what I like about Sonny Milano and these players. And a little bit I'll talk about Hendrix, Lapierre here, is they understand the gravity of the situation. There's not going to be any give-me's. And when it comes to Sonny Milano, and next year I'll talk about Hendrix, Lapierre, the Capitals threw them a life preserver. And especially in the case of Hendrix, Lapierre, who signed a bridge deal, but is waiver eligible, there is a tremendous amount at stake for Hendrix, Lapierre. But what have we seen so far? Defying yet again expectations getting a few assists in the other game there, and just engaged a really good Hendrix Lapierre. I'm loving it. And every time I watch this guy play, I just think he's ready. He's all over the place. When we saw him play the other night in Hershey, picked up a few assists. He was buzzing in the offensive zone and almost had a goal of his own. Another guy that's making a case and making the most of his opportunity. That is what I'm loving about Sonny and Hendrix Lapierre. And you can see him developing that confidence, right? That swagger. And swagger isn't something that's easily quantifiable, but it's playing confidently. And I think that what we're seeing in Hendrix Lapierre is he's playing confidently, right? And he's not just a passenger out there. He's driving plays. He's making things happen. And I'm here to tell you, you take a look at Milano, you take a Lapierre, that there is a distinct possibility you could be looking at your third line, two players on the third line for the Capitals. And, I know that Connor McMichael is going to get the kick at the can at the third line center position, but Hendrix Lapierre has looked really good thus far. And, not to disparage Connor, he played well in the game as well. But it wouldn't be the end of the world. I guess I'm going to say if Connor's playing that second line left wing. I know it's really early, right, guys, that it's only the second preseason game, but I'm kind of taking this incrementally. And right now, Hendrix Lapierre, check. Sonny Milano, check. A lot to like from those two players already. And ultimately for Hendrix Lapierre, that is what you want to see from a young center who's trying to prove that he belongs on the NHL level full time. That, I'm not good for a little bit and then get sent down to Hershey, that I belong in the National Hockey League. And he's doing that. At the end of the day, despite how all of this shakes out, you got to think for Hendrix Lapierre and Sonny Milano, both of those players, that they put their best foots forward and made a great impression. Andrew Cristall and Ivan Miroshnichenko also chipped in as well. And both of those guys scoring early is huge. And, just as true, with a lot of other teams and other sports, if you can play with an advantage, oftentimes you play more confidently. So Cristall and Miroshnichenko finding the back of the net is huge. Like I said, it sets the tone. It gives the Capitals the momentum. Because, let's face it here, with so many forwards competing for limited spots, you can't afford to go quiet in camp. And so far, players are making bigger waves than others. I guess I'm going to say that Sonny Milano has made the biggest waves thus far. Hendrix Lapierre right in that mix. Andrew Cristall in the last game. There's several, shall we say, players that have done some good things. But for some other players, and the player I'm going to talk about here next is maybe slipping through the cracks here a little bit. And that's Ethan Frank. And he's another one of those bubble players. Got caught in a tough spot where he's shown he can contribute, but the roster math isn't doing him any favors. Again, Chris Patrick said a unique opportunity, but there's very limited spots on the roster and a lot of options. Ethan Frank, okay, this needs to be a shot across his bow to say, I've got to bring it the next time I'm given an opportunity. The Capitals play on Sunday, and we'll see who's in the mix there as well. But we need to see a whole lot more from him. But he does have skills in his skill set, right? Has won the fastest skater in the AHL. He's got a good shot. He's got that ability to break that game open with one chance. But is there room? That's the big question, that there's already players that are ahead of him, that he is going to have to seize the moment, or he could be one of the odd men out. So unfortunately, for a guy like Ethan Frank, when you got guys like Milano, Lapierre, Cristall, sort of, Miroshnichenko, all pushing at the same time, someone's going to get squeezed out. That's just the way that it is. And, it's important, not to have favorites, that I want the best player out on the ice. I don't want a good story. If it is Milano, if it's Lapierre, then that's great. I just want the absolute best players that are out there. And then on the back end, Vincent Iorio, impressive in this game as well. And that's a name that keeps coming up here for me. And if you are a longtime Capitals fan and are aware of the younger players within the organization, you should be quite aware of Vincent Iorio. He put on 17 pounds this summer, 17. He wanted to be one of those players not so easily driven off the puck. And that's not just him hitting the gym harder. That is a serious commitment. That is him saying, I want to take the next step. And in the final segment of today's show, I'm going to talk about the question marks surrounding John Carlson. So it's good for the Capitals that they have a guy like Vincent Iorio in-house. And what we saw in the game in Hershey, he was physical. He was strong along the boards. He moved the puck with confidence. And, when I look at Iorio, I think there is a young defenseman the Caps need to keep around. But with same is true with him. With a lot of the other players, the problem is waivers. If you try to send him down, you risk losing him. What have we done? What have we done, Chris Patrick, with some of these guys? And I know it's just the way that it is, but I'm going to talk about a little bit later all the players that are going to have to be exposed to the waiver wire if they don't make the Capitals and we try to send them down to Hershey. It is a substantial list, and that makes the decision that much harder. And there is a real belief out there that Vincent Iorio would be a good option as that extra defender like Dylan McIlrath and Alex Alexiev did last year. So in that mix also is Declan Chisholm, but Vincent Iorio. But being that we're talking about the blue line, being that we're talking about that extra defender, Dylan McIlrath, a big, tough veteran, but his spot's not exactly guaranteed, a little bit long in the tooth as far as that is concerned. Iorio is coming in younger. And Declan Chisholm, again, also vying for those jobs. That when I said that it's, going to be a camp like one that we haven't seen in quite some time, that was an understatement. I have not seen this level of compete. I have not seen this, amount of players' jobs up for grabs and players that could be, potentially exposed to the waiver wire. It is a bit worrisome. For me as a Capitals fan, as some of these players I had high hopes for, and we know that not all of those players are going to make their way down to Hershey. But Declan Chisholm, right? He was the guy that the Capitals got from the Minnesota Wild. And what did we see? Mobile, smart with the puck, not flashy, but effective. So it's not going to get easier. And, like I talked about in yesterday's episode as well, is what's going on in net. Clay Stevenson, played the complete game when he was supposed to split it with Charlie Lindgren. 15 saves on 16 shots, so he wasn't under a tremendous amount of pressure. But what we saw from Clay Stevenson in the game, he looked poised, calm, under pressure. You could see why the coaching staff likes him. But here's the reality. Another player to be exposed to the waiver wire. So, you got penciled in Logan Thompson and Charlie Lindgren. That is your goalie tandem, right? But it's my belief that I would consider trading a Charlie Lindgren if that is the case, because I think that Clay Stevenson's trajectory far surpasses Chucky's. Not to say Chucky's a bad goalie, but I've never thought Chucky was elite. I think that Clay Stevenson could be elite. So where does Stevenson fit in? Like I said, it's tough because the guy deserves a look, but he's earned it. And if you expose him to the waiver wire, you will absolutely see him claimed by another team. I'm 99% sure that if Clay Stevenson gets exposed to the waiver wire, there's another team that's going to scoop him up. Whether it is bigger plans for, an NHL team or an AHL team, he is a prototypical modern day netminder. He's big, he moves well in the crease, and if what we saw in the game in Hershey is any indicator of where he's at, quite a great option for the Capitals. It's unfortunate that so many of these players could potentially be exposed to the waiver wire. Really quickly here, I'm going to talk to you about the players that are eligible to be on waivers here. Sonny Milano, Hendrix Lapierre, Justin Sordoff, We already heard about Spencer Smallman, Sheldon Rempel, Graham Clark, Henrik Rubinski, Bogdan Triniev, Ethan Frank, Dylan McElrath, Vincent Iorio, Louis Belpedio, Callie Rosen, and Clay Stevenson. Again, we know that what has happened today with some of those players, and that is just the list from before camp started, but a substantial list of players. And the ones of note there: Sonny Milano, Hendrix Lapierre, Justin Sordiff. As I take a look at that, Ethan Frank, Dylan McElrath, Vincent Iorio, and Clay Stevenson. Wow, they're not all going to get claimed by other teams, but even say a few of those players get claimed by another team. Not optimal for the Capitals. All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about Andrew Cristall making the most of his opportunity and making some noise. I'll discuss next. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I love using FanDuel because it fits however you like to bet. Player props, building a same-game parlay, or even jumping in live as the action unfolds. It makes every game more exciting, whether you're watching your team or just keeping an eye on your fantasy lineup. It's quick, easy, and the best way to add a little bit more energy to Sundays. So say you're watching the Commanders or the Ravens, you already have vested interest, but say you want interest in all of the games. Open up the FanDuel app, put a little bit of money on the game. All of a sudden, they got that much more exciting. So are you ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So talking about players that are making an impact and making the most of their opportunity, Andrew Cristall is a guy that I'm rather hyped about. And if you're an everydayer of the show, you know that as I speak about him on a regular basis. But is he good enough to make the big team, or can we expect to see him down in Hershey? Let's talk about the latest with Andrew Cristall here in the second segment here. And, when we talk about him, he has that it factor. And if you don't know, well, watch him play here. Every time he touches the puck, it seems like, for me, something happens. You can feel the excitement, even when he has it, because even around Capitals fans, there is a certain level of excitement that surrounds the young prospect in Andrew Cristall. And you can see, when he's out there, defenders backing off because, he's got that playmaking ability and, the patience, the vision. And he's worked on, his skating, the things that he needs to work on. But the thing that's most lethal is his shot. And what we saw in the game most here recently is it's coming along rather nicely. And scoring in the game against the Flyers in Hershey, that was a big thing for him. Why? Because he is trying to do the unthinkable thing and crack the opening night roster. But the thing of it wasn't, just the goal. It's the way he carried himself, the way he drove the play, that he doesn't seem like this young guy anymore that's just, inexperienced, shall we say. He seems like he fit and that he belongs in the mix. Now, Cristall's not just trying to make the team. He's trying to make the coaches say, we can't send him back. If you think back to, Alexei Protas, several years ago when he was in camp for the Capitals, that he was supposed to be here as just one of the young guys and made a case. And guess what? Made the roster. I think that, when it comes to Andrew Cristall, he is in a similar position. But when you're trying to make a case for yourself, not just score a goal, that's a big difference maker. And I think that speaks volumes, because I think, Spencer Carberry, I think Chris Patrick and, Carberry's assistants, they see that hunger. And, you see him play out there, and it's not like you think to yourself, there's a guy that would play good on the fourth line or the third line. You're thinking a top six winger down the road, maybe sooner than we thought. And it wouldn't be surprising to me, like I said, if you listen or watch this show on a regular basis and every day, or that I talk about it. But when you listen to the beat writers and a lot of the people that cover the Capitals, it's kind of a foregone conclusion that he'll play in Hershey. But Cristall's here to say, not so fast. I'm ready to make an impression, and I'm going to prove you all why I should be playing in the NHL. And, ultimately, that's what excites me about Cristall. He doesn't look overwhelmed by the situation. He just doesn't look at it like a kid that's, like, hey, I'm just happy to be here. He looks like he belongs. And why is that? Because he surrounds himself with successful people, like maybe you heard of Connor Bedard, those kind of guys. So now what does that mean if he starts in Washington, and will he start with the Capitals? That's the big question, because when you take a look at the roster math, like a lot of the other players I've talked about in today's episode, it's tough. And the hard part with him is you don't want to rush him. But, did they rush him? I don't think that the Capitals did rush him. I think that if he would have been in the lineup last year, even though I would have loved it, might have been a little bit rushing. But he had his opportunity in Kelowna and Spokane and absolutely torched it. But he's really making it difficult to ignore him. Like, I'm not the young guy. I belong here. I'm not so sure. Boom, 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 pounding on that door that, no, I belong here. And again, it's going to be interesting to see how his game progresses as the camp and the games go along. But ultimately for the Capitals, what I've spoke about in tonight, the multitude of options that they have, that's a good problem for the Capitals to have. Like I said in yesterday's show, some teams are having a hard time trying to patch together a team. Like they got players in on PTOs and just a bunch of young guys that they know aren't going anywhere. The Capitals have what I perceive a lot of either NHL talent or near NHL talent. Because when you think about it, they're searching for that next wave of young talent. And what we see here, that Ovechkin is on this team, could be playing his last season. Carlson, Trevor Van Riemsdyk, those kind of players that you're looking for the next wave. And, a lot in the same breath, Ryan Leonard, Andrew Cristall could be a centerpiece in that next wave. And you can see why Chris Patrick is so high on him. And I think you ultimately should be too. And when people like to talk about, remember, Dan, he went lower in the draft. Yeah, he did, because he was a smaller guy and his skating wasn't that great. He worked on the things he could work on. He bulked up, the right way. He hired a skating coach. I think this is the best version of Andrew Cristall I have seen thus far, but definitely a player to keep an eye on in every preseason game that he's involved in, every shift, because it feels like it matters. And, ultimately the ball's in his court, just like a lot of these other players, that it's ultimately up to them to seize the day. But in a really early take here, I know we're only in the second preseason game, another game on Sunday, I am loving what I have seen from Andrew Cristall so far. All right, so coming up here after the break, a bit of a tougher question. The future of John Carlson. Does he have a future beyond this season? I'll discuss straight ahead. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The best way that you can help grow the show is to subscribe to Locked On Capitals on YouTube and comment anything down below. So in the final segment of today's show, we're talking about good old number 74, John Carlson. Even if you're retired today, he is going to be thought of as one of the greatest defenders for the Capitals, of course, but in the NHL, a minute monster, a guy that plays sound defensively, has a good offensive flair at times as well, that it's not plug and play, right? That, we can't just take this guy out of Hershey and plug him in and have John Carlson 2.0. In today's episode, I talked about Vinny Iorio, right, as, a potential piece of the future. But, guys like John Carlson are not easily replaceable. So that is kind of the quandary or the interesting position that Chris Patrick and John Carlson find themselves in. So let's dive into that in the final segment of today's show, because we know that John Carlson has been a centerpiece of the team and more specifically of the blue line for years. He's logged heavy minutes. He's quarterbacked the power play, and he's been that veteran, steady presence on the blue line. But just like the rest of us out there, he's not getting any younger. And the real question is about what role will he have going forward? And that's one of the things that, Chris Patrick has talked about. That's one of the things that John Carlson has spoke about is, are the Capitals leaning into a younger direction? Do they want to usher in the next wave of young defenders as we see that it's kind of just bubbling up to the top here? Or would it be worthwhile having John Carlson around as a bit of a mentor? It's interesting because, when you talk about these older players and he's still in good shape, are they standing in the way of progress of some younger players? Like I said, off the top, John Carlson is not a plug and play replacement. I still think he holds value. The thing I'm going to say, just like when we talk about the waiver wire, if the Capitals don't come to terms with him by the end of this coming season here, they get nothing for him. So if the belief is that there is no long-term plans, the Capitals would be better to trade him. And do the Caps keep leaning on him for 23 to 24 minutes a night? Not sustainable. That's why they brought in reinforcements. That's why they brought in a guy like Jacob Chychrun. But that's the hard part. This is a Capitals team in transition. Are they trying to, give more pressure on and more responsibility to Rasmus Sandin or, like I said, eventually Vincent Iorio? Because the thing of it is, like I said, is Carlson's value right now is still high. Teams would still line up to have him on their team. There is no doubt. He is a proven top 4 defenseman. And, the thing of it is that if they trade him earlier, they can get more. If it's at the trade deadline, you can still get a decent return. But if the Capitals really don't have a long-term plan, I think that's the right thing to do. But like I said, it's all about direction. Are you starting to retool around the young guys? And if the answer is somewhere in the middle, then Carlson is the right center of that decision. So, that's the value that Carlson holds. Still can play a lot of minutes. We saw him play a lot of minutes last season as well. But at some point, you are going to see a diminished return. You're not going to be able to see John Carlson playing 25 plus minutes a night. It's just not sustainable the older he gets. And I'll say this, I still think he has, plenty left in the tank. I'm not trying to say that he should be out to pasture. The guy can still produce, he can still defend, and he still has that veteran leadership, which is something that, teams need. And, even closer to home here, like if you're a Nationals fan, you know what I'm talking about. So it's not just about, what he does on the ice. It's also about the leadership, that the guy knows how to handle himself under the big lights in big pressure situations. And that if some of the younger players like Vincent Iorio, for example, could take a page from him, that could be key. The question is what does the new deal look like, right? Do they sign him to a 1-year deal? I've heard some people sign him up to a 3 to 5. I don't really think John Carlson's getting a 3 to 5 year deal at this point. I think the absolute max would be a 2 to 3 year deal. But I think, a lot of this is Chris Patrick. He's going to have to really mull this over and decide, what direction this team is going in. And I still think he's a bit uncertain. And of course, money factors into this, right? Everything does, circles around money, but an interesting position for the Capitals to be in. To me, just what we've observed so far, I think that there is a hunger for this team to embrace the youth. I know that we had heard that they went after, Nikolai Ehlers and kicked the tires a bit on Jack Roslovic. And I think that, ultimately, if the Capitals wanted to, they could have, got a Nikolai Ehlers. They would have just had to give up, quite a bit to get him. And the Capitals don't want to do that anymore. They've done that before where, take a bunch of our prospects, take draft picks, take, a big roster player, just do whatever we got to do to get the shiny toy. No, I think what the Capitals are doing now is they're trying to build a team that's sustainable for years to come. Not win now, not win in the 25-26 season, not win in the 25 through 27 season, but sustain success for years upon years to come. And it's the right tactic to take, and I think that, myself included, we can kind of get drawn into, why didn't we get that shiny toy, right? Why didn't we get a Nikolai Ehlers? Why didn't we get, fill in the blank big name around the NHL? I think the Capitals are in a good position. And, if there is, the perception that John Carlson is not a part of the future, let's see what we can get in return. Kind of like what I talked about with Charlie Lindgren as well, is that, a team is not going to give you anything, for a Clay Stevenson because they know he's going to hit the waiver wire. But you could get something for a guy like Charlie Lindgren. A lot for GM Chris Patrick to juggle. And, Brian McClellan is in the mix still as well. A lot of things to consider, that is for sure. Keep it to Locked On Capitals for sure, as I expect more cuts on Saturday. As the roster is going to get whittled down. Some players, more players. I know we have had some players cut down and exposed to waivers already, but expect to see more players that could potentially hit the waiver wire. Exciting and yet kind of anxiety-inducing, I guess, is I'm a bit upset and worried about some of these players on the team that have been pillars for so many years, possibly leaving the team for nothing. Make sure and keep it locked right here. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You are what makes this show successful. When you're done here, head on over to Locked On NHL, as they have you covered 5 days a week, available wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.